would like to dedicate the shir tonight in schus, in the merit of, and for the full shleima of Moiri Rabbi, a great, one of the greatest scholars of our time is Rabbi Ulman Goldberg, who needs a full shleima, and may this shir be a merit to his recovery. So the topic tonight is demystifying misconceptions and myths and stories about the Jewish divorce, called a geth. The concept of a geth in Judaism, like any other idea, is a mitzvah. It's a commandment. A commandment doesn't mean that it's a good thing to get divorced, God forbid. A commandment means that there are 613 biblical commandments, and out of these 613 we have 248 positives and 365 negatives. They're all somehow enumerated in the written Torah, even though, as I mentioned in one of the lessons, in a very, very cryptic, almost in a code sort of way. And they are elaborated and explained at great length in the oral Torah. And when we say there is a mitzvah to do something, it doesn't always mean it's a mitzvah even though in a colloquial language. We use it as something which is good. It's a mitzvah to help another person, and so on and so forth. But in a very technical halachic term, mitzvah means one of the commandments. And just like there's a commandment, for example, to, if somebody stole something, it's a commandment to return that which he stole. But once you steal, there becomes a positive mitzvah to give it back. And sometimes with certain types of theft, you have to give extra back. It's called, you give a certain knas, like a fine that you give more than you have actually stolen. And that's one of the 248 positive commandments. Similarly, there's a commandment in the Torah that if a couple decides that they want to separate, the only way it can be done is by a Jewish divorce called a geth. And all of this in the written Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, it's all based on one verse, which we'll read a week from this Shabbos. And the verse says that after it talks about why a couple should get divorced, it says, and he wrote her a bill of divorce and presented it into her hand and sent her from his house. That's all that says in the 5 books of Moses about a divorce. And as we explained numerous times, the oral Torah, which explains the law, which was given at the same time, elaborates on that mitzvah. Now, to give you an idea how prolific and how broad the subject is, we have over here a volume called in a talmud, in the Babylonian talmud, called Masechta Gittin, which means a tractate of Gittin. And this is just one volume dedicated to the subject of divorces. And in the Code of Jewish Law, in the Shulchan Aruch, we have these 2 volumes that are all dedicated to the laws of Gittin. Now, on top of that, you have literally hundreds and hundreds of sforim, of books, detailing different questions that come up in the Jewish divorce. And probably thousands of different responsa, which means halachic answers to different questions that are written over the years. So this is an idea of a divorce. Why is it so expansive? Why is it so broad? The concept of a divorce in Halacha, based on this pasuk, based on this verse, is that a bill of divorce has to be written, especially for the husband and especially for the wife. In other words, let's say, for example, that the husband's name is Yaakov, and his father's name is Avraham. And his wife's name is Sarah, and her father's name is Yitzchak. And a Beth Din, and a scribe, has written a bill of divorce for that couple, and that couple changed their mind and they decided we are not going to get divorced. But there's another couple comes up with the same names, so the same date, and everything fits the bill. This particular bill of divorce is completely not valid, is disqualified from serving as a bill of divorce for the second couple, because even though everything matches, the information matches, but it's one of the conditions by which divorce has to be written. It has to be written especially for for this particular husband, not just for a generic husband with the same name, and specifically for that particular wife. More so, if you have a situation where the scribe practiced how to write a bill of divorce for a particular couple, he said, you know what, before I'm going to write the actual divorce for them, I'm going to do one practice run. And it works out perfect. He wrote for them specifically, but he had in mind that this particular geth, this particular document, is only used for practice. You cannot use it. It has to be also l'shem gerushin, for the sake of effecting with this particular bill of divorce. The husband has to appoint the scribe. It's all done in the context of the Beth Din. The reason why it's done within the Beth Din, because you can see already from the amount of details in the get that it's a highly, highly specialized procedure. And while when it comes to officiating at a marriage, there are many more rabbis that officiate a marriage, even though it also requires a lot of expertise. And sometimes, unfortunately, rabbis don't realize how much they have to study in order to be able to officiate in marriages without creating mistakes and problems and so on and so forth. But there's no question that, number one, the amount of details in divorce are much greater, and also the consequences of a non-kosher divorce are much more severe. Let me explain to you why. We know that one of the 10 commandments is the concept of a married woman having relations with a man other than her husband. That's the classical definition in Jewish law of adultery. There are many examples of infidelity, of being dishonest, of being unfaithful, but the actual idea of loisinah, committing adultery in a typical, in a specifically biblical sense, that is when a married woman who's married under chuppah v'kedushin, under a, according to the law of Moses and Israel, is unfaithful with another man. And we already explained that, number one, the severity of punishment is the utmost. It's one of the highest, because it's a very, very severely punished, from above. In times of the High Court, was punished also in a human court, but now that there's no human court, there's no Sanhedrin anymore, there's a very severe punishment from above, but also it could affect the children. And if she had a child with another Jewish man who's not her husband, the child is, as we said before, is a mamzer. So as a result, the particular consequences of a non-kosher divorce are much, much more severe than if somebody made a mistake when he married somebody. Because the worst thing that happens when you officiate at a wedding and you made a mistake and something was not valid, you could correct it. You could rectify it without any consequences to the children and so on and so forth. It's not nice, because the couple might have lived together as unmarried couple, but there's no real very heavy consequences. But when it comes to divorce, it's really very, very serious. And that is why not only it's reserved for a qualified Beth Din or judges and so on and so forth, but since we're living in the world of standards, where the concept of creating establishments with proper standards is very much emphasized in every part of life, including medicine, including law, engineering, architecture, and the same thing with Jewish law. When it comes to questions specifically of conversions and divorces, lists are made of, I have in one of my files a small list of Beth Dins in the world that are qualified and accepted to do divorces. And anybody who is not qualified to do so shouldn't be doing it, because he could be causing a lot of damage to the couple that he's trying to assist. So the husband, it's also important to know that when it says he gives into a hand, that the divorce is initiated. When I say initiated, it doesn't mean that from point of view who wants it. Either one could initiate divorce, but it has to be given by a husband. In other words, if the husband, for whatever reason, is not able to give a divorce, it is a problem. It doesn't happen automatically like in a civil law, when a couple living together, living separately for over a year, automatically can apply for civil divorce. Either one can apply for civil divorce, and it happens almost unilaterally. In Jewish law, it doesn't happen this way. Biblically, the husband has to give a divorce. It has to be given of his free will without any compulsion or any conditions. Biblically, while the wife could not be married by force, in other words, if a husband would, if a groom would come and put a ring on a woman without her consent and marry her, she wouldn't be married. She has to consent to being married. When it came to divorce, biblically, it could have been done unilaterally by a husband. And again, it's not a time to explain why, but we know that the Torah wasn't made by rabbis, it was made by, it's a divine law. That's the basis of everything that we are talking about. But in the 11th century, the same great rabbinic authority, Rabbi Gershon, who forbade bigamy and polygamy, also instituted a legislation that a woman has to consent to a divorce. You cannot just give it to her unilaterally, she has to be able to agree to it. And interesting enough, even though when it came to polygamy or bigamy, it was mainly accepted by Ashkenazi Jews, not by the Sephardi Jews, when it came to this particular legislation, it was accepted universally, that in everywhere, that a woman has to agree to a divorce. However, we'll mention in one of the lessons, I'll mention it again later on, that obviously because biblically it is possible for men to have more than one wife, it's not, therefore there are few more solutions for men whose wife is refusing to cooperate. It's not easy, it's difficult, and there are less solutions for a woman. When it comes to a forcing a get, it's called geth me'usa, forced geth. So usually, in most cases, it's not valid. So if, technically speaking, a husband was forced to give a get, he was beaten up, the Talmud says the get is not valid. One of the questions that we asked the husband and the wife at the time of the giving of the get, are you willing to give a get, to accept the get of your own free will without compulsion or conditions? And a few steps are taken in order to ensure that happening, that nobody could later challenge the get. And the very, very rare situations, the Talmud says that you actually are allowed to give corporal punishment. You can actually physically force a husband to give a get at sheyomer, until he says, Roitzani, I want to do it. And the commentaries, including the Rambam, the Maimonides, that discuss what do you mean he says he wants it. He only says he wants to give a get because he was beaten and he was forced to do it. He was tortured. So he's not sincere. So the Rambam gives a very unique explanation. The Rambam says that we're only talking about a case when a Torah mandates that he could be forced and he has to give a get. Any other time, him saying that he wants it because he's forced wouldn't help him. But in those few situations, when the Torah, the Jewish law, the Halacha, mandates that he could be forced, every single Jew wants to do what's right. Every single Jew wants to do the right thing according to Jewish law. And sometimes when he doesn't do the right thing, it's not really him. It's certain external barriers that are created, his animal impulse, his negative impulse, that makes him do the wrong thing. So ultimately, when a Jew says, I want to do something which is right in Jewish law, then it's sincere whether he knows it himself or not. And the Rambam says that the biggest proof of this is that if later on the Beis Din realized they made a mistake, and in this particular situation the husband wasn't in such a category that you were able to force him physically to give a get, then the get is invalid. It has to be really such a unique situation where the husband is obligated by Jewish law to give a get, and therefore when he's forced to do so and he says, I want to do it, it's actually considered to be sincere. So all these things show us that when the husband and wife show up to give a get, first of all, we have to be able to study what names to write in the get. It's much more complicated than in a kesuba, in a marriage document. The marriage document, you take a name, how a person is called to the Torah, or a woman, how she was called at birth. So if a name is Sarah Bas Avrom, you write in the kesuba, in a marriage document, Sarah, daughter of Avram, and for men you write Avram, son of Jacob, son of Yaakov, and that's it. In a geth, there are volumes and volumes and volumes just how to write names. You have to write every nickname. You have to write names by which a person called. You write a person called Yaakov Yitzchok, known as Yaakov, known as Jack, and so on and so forth. And it gets quite complicated. So that's why we always make sure, unless it's an emergency geth, we'll prepare all the names beforehand, because sometimes you have to do some research and find out certain things. And the laws are really quite complicated. Even how you describe the nicknames or the other names that he has. Sometimes you write demystifies, which means also called by a name, and sometimes you write hamechuna, which means also known or nicknamed as such, which each one is important to write in each situation properly. So we prepare all of the information. The husband and wife will first of all talk about a typical geth. When the husband and wife both come to the Beth Din, the questions are asked in the beginning to make sure they're doing it of their own free will without compulsion or conditions, and certain mechanisms are put into place that nobody could challenge later on and say, no, they were under duress. They have to make certain statements that annul any previous statements that could make the geth invalid. And after everything is done in that particular area, the husband officially appoints the scribe to write the geth, and he tells him, write the geth especially for me, especially for her, and especially for affecting with her a divorce. He appoints it's a very formal language with special booklets that actually read, so the wording is exact. He appoints the witnesses to sign the geth with the same stipulation, and then the geth is written. The geth is written with the same types of letters as the mezuzahs and tefillin are written. It can be typed, it can be written with a running writing. It's written by hand with a special quill. This is just to give you an idea how the geth is written over here. It always has 12 lines. It must have 12 lines plus 2 half lines for the witnesses. And it takes approximately, depending on how many names and whatever, it could take up to an hour to write the geth, and depending on the witnesses, how proficient they are. Sometimes usually we try to use the same witnesses who already know how to sign, but sometimes we have new witnesses, they have long names, it takes them a long time, and so on and so forth. It takes a bit of art to do it. Before that, it's very important to know, according to biblical and Talmudic law, the geth has to be the possession of the husband. And when it changes hands from being the husband's to being the wife's, that's when she becomes divorced by Jewish law. So how do we make sure the geth belongs to the husband? Always, before he appoints the scribe who has all of the intricate instruments, including the quill and the ink and the paper and a special board that you make the lines on, everything is like, it's a whole kit. The scribe gives this as a present to the husband. He says, I'm giving it to you, but matona gemura, as an absolute gift. And the husband lifts it up, because lifting up an object is one of the legal transactions and acquisitions in Jewish law, and it becomes his. So when he gives it afterwards to the scribe to write with it after he appoints him, the scribe is actually writing with the quill and ink and paper and all the writing materials which belong to the husband. And afterwards, again, it belongs to the husband all the way until it reaches the wife's hands. I want to tell you just a story that happened. Everything happens when you do these things for many years. You experience things that never happen, but they have to happen once, just so you can write it down as something unusual. One time, this story goes back approximately 10 years ago. We were still sitting in the great synagogue. For the last 5.5 years, the Beth Din has moved into our synagogue over here on Bryan Street, which is much more convenient. All the paper, all of the files are here. It saves a lot of time. But until that time, we used to sit in the great synagogue. And whenever we do emergency gittin, emergency, like out of the ordinary, because we would sit every single week on Thursdays. We would do it over here in my place. So one time I get a call from a member of the community, and he said, there's a lady over here and a couple that want to have a get as soon as possible. Very important. He explained why. I didn't see exactly why it was such an urgent thing, but he said, do me a favor, fit them in outside, because we are booked always for a number of weeks. And the secretary always looks up and says, okay, says next available time is such and such. So he said, please fit them in the middle, do me a special favor. All right, we'll do them a special favor. So we fit them in, they come here, and we do the get, and as usual, the scribe gives the whole bag to the husband, and the husband acquires it, and the get is written. And at the end, I'm going to tell you later how it's handed over, we'll talk about it in a minute. And after, always at the very end, once the get is finished, everything, the very last thing we do before the couple goes away, the divorced couple goes away, we ask the husband to give all of the equipment to the scribe. I don't want to say give back to him, because it's his. It's not like he's giving back something which belongs to the scribe. It belongs to the husband. But we ask him to give it to him as a present, so he'll be able to continue to write divorces. So when we finished, I turned to the husband and said, could you please give it to him as a present? He has to write divorces. And he takes it, he was about to give it to the scribe, and his freshly divorced wife tells him, don't give it to him. What are you talking about? He just gave it to you as a present. It's a joke or something. They gave it to you as an absolute gift. Keep it. And the husband, you can see that he's still under the influence of his wife, and is still completely, he's divorced her just now, but she still has a total power over him. He's just standing there, doesn't know what to do. And I said to him, listen, it's a very, very rare material. Get it from Israel. You can't get it in Australia. You're not planning to write a get yourself, so he'll appreciate it if you give it to him. So I says, no way, you're not giving it to him. Out of the question. And the guy walks out with it. He walked away with it, and he never gave it. Later on, I told the guy who convinced me to organize a get, it was such a special favor to him. I said, maybe you go and talk to him and try to get it. Nothing happened. That we lost that bag of equipment. We lost never to get it back. But that happened only once in over 25 years that I was here. It never happened again. But that's, like I said before, everything has to happen once. So after the get is being written and signed, after certain also legalities, when we question the scribe and the witnesses if they did everything right, a certain specific questions we ask them, the get is folded in a very specific manner. It's folded like a document which doesn't open, with with a flap over here. You see it, one side. After it's folded like this, and the bottom part goes into the top part. And this is part which is a bit traumatic. The wife stands opposite the husband, and she holds her hands like this, and the husband holds the get just above her hands, like in the following manner, and he repeats after the judge special words of severance. He says, "Harei ze gitech, this is your get. V'is kabli gitech ze, and receive this your get. Uvo, and with it, ta'yim migureshes memeni be divorced from him from now onwards. V'harei at muteres lechol adam, and behold, you're permitted to any man. And that was, you're permitted to marry anybody else." And he drops it into her hands like this. And after he drops and she's holding hands like this. After he drops into her hand, she holds her hands very still, because the Bible says, and he gives it to her. Not that she takes it herself, he gives it to her. And after it's dropped in the hand, she covers it completely with her hands. She lifts it up to acquire it. As we mentioned before, it's a legal acquisition to lift up an object. She puts it under her arm like a pocket to show that she can do whatever she wants with it. And she takes a walk with it, a few meters, to show her independence. And after that, we tell them that they are divorced, and we make a special cut on the get. It's a special, we take a razor, and we put, it's called kera bezdin. It's a cut which shows that the get has done its job. And after that, they are divorced. They will receive special documents. The get itself remains always in the archives of the Beth Din. And we tell the woman that she can marry, they both can remarry, but she can't marry a Kohen and she has to wait for 92 clear days before she gets married. It's to do with I spoke about it, I think, last week, about a special waiting period to assure the identity of the child if she is pregnant. And that's the end of the geth. Now, the reason, for whatever reason, there are many, many misconceptions flying around about what happens over there. Many times we get a call and we are told, we'd like to know what happens there, because we hear that somebody, a woman, has to spit in her husband's face in the middle of the geth. And I know where this rumor is coming from, because there is another very unusual ceremony which we'll discuss at a different time, called the chalitza. Chalitza is another biblical process when a husband dies without having any children, and before the wife remarries somebody else, she has to have a special chalitza, special ceremony which releases her from a brother-in-law, if the husband has a brother. You'll find this also in Book of Deuteronomy. And in that particular ceremony, the wife actually spits not on her husband's face, but she spits on the floor. It's a very unusual, as much as a geth is a very legalistic and very logical ceremony, everything makes sense with a geth. I mean, obviously there are biblical and Talmudic things that are spelled out to us, but everything that happens, why we do this, why we do that, everything has a reason. When it comes to chalitza, it's purely divine. There's no, everything is divine, but chalitza is very, very, it's so illogical, and it's so, everything over there is because it says so in the Bible, no other reason. Chalitza is involved with the wife taking off a special shoe from her brother-in-law. It's a special sandal that is made especially for this purpose. And after it's done, she spits on the floor and she says, "So is done for a man who refuses to build his brother's home," because the idea of levirate marriage is a concept of perpetuating the name of the deceased husband. Now, obviously, we're talking about a case where they both want to marry somebody else, and today, especially in Ashkenazi communities, there's no levirate marriages. The brother-in-law never marries his sister-in-law. There's always a chalitza, always a separation process. But nevertheless, that's what the Bible says. If you want to separate, there has to be this thing. But with a geth, there's never any spitting. But people mix it up and they hear different stories. So we hear all kinds of questions. How is the woman treated? Is she treated with dignity? The reality is that anybody who went through a geth knows how much sensitivity, how far we go to try to make sure that this particular process is as easy as possible. It's never easy to face when the husband faces his wife is divorcing and telling her into her face, "Hareze getech," but that's the situation. And we always offer the woman, if she wants to bring anybody together with her for moral support, she can bring somebody with her who will sit there, and this itself makes it much easier. What happens if the husband and wife don't want to be in the same room? Sometimes it's very amicable. They divorced already civilly for quite a number of years. They have common children. They're friendly with each other, and they have no problem whatsoever. Sometimes there's a lot of bad blood, and the relationship is very toxic. In such a case, in the first instance, we keep them apart in different rooms. We sometimes, they're not together. They're questioned separately. And only for the final part, when the geth is given over from his hand to her hand, that's when they come. It could take literally a couple of minutes. But there are sometimes a situation where even that isn't possible, either because they can't look at each other, they can't be in the same room. Sometimes there's even an AVO taken against, usually against the husband in most cases. And there are legal reasons why they can't be in the same room. Then there is a way how to do it through an agent. And the process is very, very similar. It's a bit more paperwork. But instead of, before the husband appoints the scribe and the witnesses, he appoints an agent who is going to watch the geth being written and signed. And later on, he will be the one to deliver it on behalf of the husband to the wife. That's the second possibility. And many times when we deal with international, and that happens all the time, by the way, we deal with international divorces when the husband is in Israel and the wife is in Australia, or the husband is in Australia and the wife is in Europe or in America. So what happens is that you have to appoint a agent who will actually see the geth being written and signed, but then he appoints a designated agent who is one of the staff of the Beth Din in the country where the wife is, and he will be the one actually to deliver, as a second agent, to deliver the geth to the wife in front of the Beth Din, in front of the witnesses. So these are the most common ways how to do it. Sometimes even that is impossible. For example, sometimes you have a situation where the husband says, I don't want to give a geth, but if I have to, I'm happy to do something very quick. I want to come, sign something, and that's it. I won't stay for 2 hours in the Beth Din. It happens sometimes that the husband is not very cooperative. If the wife is not cooperative, she can come at the very end, and her part will take literally only 10 minutes. But the husband, he has to be the one to appoint everybody else, and so on and so forth. There is a way how to do it shorter, only for the husband. For the actual Beth Din, it's as long. But the husband, instead of staying for the whole writing of the geth and then giving it over either to the wife or to the agent, he reads an authorization that is prepared in English, and he appoints the present scribe, who has to be there, the scribe, the witnesses, and the agent, and he signs it. After he reads all of the appointments, he signs the paper, he goes away, and everything is done without his presence. It gets more complicated. We know there were many times in our history when husbands had to be in a place where there was no Beth Din. For example, in a place that they were sent to Siberia, and in Siberia there was no Beth Din. Sometimes there were certain cities which had a Beth Din in certain cities, but many times they were sent to some kind of hard labor in some small town in Siberia, and what they would do in such a case, and this is something which is done only in a situation where, without doing that, the wife would remain an aguna, she remain like a straw widow, a woman without a husband and without a geth. So in such a case, they would prepare a authorization, and they would find at least 2 witnesses to hear the husband appointing everybody out loud and signing it, and they would send authorization to Beth Din in one of the Jewish cities, and they would write the geth in that city and give it over to the wife. That was done literally only in such a case. Even here in Australia, I remember a few times it happened to me that I had to go. I was called by the rabbinate in Israel. I was told there is a Israeli man sitting in jail in Long Bay or Silverwater, one of those jails, and I would come with a scribe and 2 witnesses to jail, and I would prepare the authorization for the husband. He would read it in front of them. He would appoint the scribe and the witnesses and the agent, and then would write the geth, and I would send it to the Beth Din in Israel. So here in Australia, even when somebody's in jail, it's still possible to do it in the way that will authorize them in front of them. But we had many cases, and this is something which you can know how you can apply the law to modern times. In a situation when the husband is somewhere in a place where there's no Beth Din, and it's very difficult, he won't come to Sydney, or he won't come to any other place with to be in the presence of a scribe, even to appoint a scribe and the witnesses, then it's possible, and I'll explain to you how the law adapts to this situation. It's possible for the husband to appoint all these people involved, scribe and witnesses and so on and so forth, through internet. It's also important that next to him there should be 2 or 3 people, 3 to make a Beth Din and 2 to make 2 witnesses. But it's possible that instead of actually being in the same room as the scribe and the witnesses, you could do it over the internet. And we do it many times in a situation where it's impossible otherwise. I'll give you an example. I got a call, this story goes back maybe 4 years ago, something like that. I got a call from a colleague of mine who's the head of the Beth Din in Tel Aviv. And he says to me, look, there is a woman who is waiting for a geth for 7 years. A husband somewhere in the outback of Australia, nobody knows where he is. Maybe you can find him. And so I said, look, we'll try. I don't know where to start looking, but give me his name, give me his information, and we'll see what we can do. A week later, I don't know if you heard, there is an organization in Australia called Rara. Rara is a young Hasidic men. They go to all of the outback places in Australia, Northern Territory, New South Wales, you name it, all around, and they find Jewish people who live outside, who are not in a part of the community. They search for them and they create activities for them, try to bring them closer to Judaism. So I get a call from a young man, and he says to me, look, we're visiting this small, I forgot the name of the place, a small place in northern New South Wales. And we found a man, and he says he had no connection for years to anybody Jewish. And he says that he feels very guilty because he has a wife that he didn't give her a get, and he would like to give her a get. And I right away checked his name, and lo and behold, it was the same person. And I remember this was a month of Elul, and within a couple of days, we had the get ready. We had to do it over internet. I forget, it was WhatsApp or whatever it was, FaceTime, whatever tools we used. And the two boys acted as witnesses. So we prepared a special authorization with these two witnesses. They send authorization to us. They appointed through Skype the scribe, the witnesses, and the agent. We wrote the get over here, and I had somebody traveling. It was before COVID, so people traveled all the time. So with somebody going back, one of the Mishlochim, one of the rabbis who come for fundraising, he went back to Israel. Within a week after this rabbi called us, the get was delivered to the Beth Din, and she was divorced by that time. Now, you can ask the question, how does the law allow you to do it through internet? And the answer is that even that, it's a bit too complicated to explain in a couple of words, but all of the reasons why the scribe and the witnesses have to be appointed in front of the husband, I can't say all the reasons, but most of them disappear with the clear identity through internet, especially when the husband has next to him 2 or 3 witnesses that also identify him, who he is, and therefore it's not because we somehow implemented a new invention. We actually many important halachic responses were written in order to be able to do it properly. And when I went to this historic trip to Israel for 24 hours last year, when I spoke mainly about conversion of children born from surrogate mothers, non-Jewish surrogate mothers or non-Jewish egg donors, my second talk was about the subject, how to be able to do the divorce through internet in the best possible way, under the circumstances which are possible otherwise. So just to finish off, and then we'll have some questions I could talk about. Geth is, like I said before, it's a very, very rich subject, and there are many interesting stories that happen. I want to tell you an interesting story that happened a number of years ago. There was a very nice family in Sydney. Unfortunately, the husband, something happened to him mentally, and he started to misbehave and become abusive. And it came to a point where the wife realized that they can't live together anymore, and she wanted to get a divorce from him. And he didn't want to give her a divorce. And one time, and this was before the festival of Sukkot, between Kippur and Sukkot, we were sitting and writing a get, and suddenly I received a phone call from this man who was in a psychiatric hospital somewhere in Bronte over here. There's a psychiatric hospital. And he calls me up, and by the way, in order to give a get, you have to be sane. But the definition of being sane is not, it doesn't mean that if a person has some kind of a mental illness, automatically is disqualified. It means the person he has to know what he's doing. So one time we had to do a get for a man who was put in a psychiatric facility somewhere in Western Australia, outside of Perth. And we had my colleague Rabbi Gutnik, who also knows how to write. He's not our official scribe, but when we have to, when we've not other choice, he writes the gittin. And especially in a situation where somebody appoints him, in other words, if somebody appoints a scribe, it has to be the one that is next to the person. He happened to be in Perth, and he went together with the local rabbi to that to that facility, and they got this person to appoint the scribe and the witnesses and so on and so forth. When we wrote the geth, we asked the rabbi with the second witness to travel back to the facility so he'll testify to us that at the time of writing of the geth and giving over of the geth, the person was, because he had a very, very, very severe schizophrenia, and he was in and out. Sometimes he knew what was happening, and sometimes he didn't. So we had to ascertain that he was with it, so to speak, not just when he appointed everybody, but even when the geth was written, because the concept is that when an agent acts on behalf of the one who sent him, the one who sent him has to be also capacitated to do so. So when this particular husband called me from this Bronte facility, I thought it was an opportunity to convince him to give a geth to his wife. So I started to talk to him while the other geth was written, was being written by the scribe. And he was telling me that he doesn't want to give a geth, and I was trying to convince him. And we spoke for about an hour, and just when I thought I was convincing him, he changed his mind. At one point in the middle of the whole thing, I suggested to him, how about we do an authorization? And you authorize everybody, and it's done, and she'll feel that you're already, And later on, when you'll tell us, you'll tell us authorized to give the geth. And he didn't respond to it. He didn't agree to it. We continued to discuss everything, and at one point he says, "You know what? Okay, I'll do it." So I grabbed everybody. I had the whole team in the beth, and I took the scribe, I took the witnesses, I took myself. On the way, while we were driving, I prepared the authorization, and we arrived in the psychiatric ward. And I came and I hugged him, said hello to him, and I gave him the authorization. And he appointed. I explained to him what it's all about. He understood what's happening. He appointed everybody, and I quickly took it. I didn't even tell everybody else to sign. After he signed it, and I said goodbye to him, we went out in the car while we were driving and got everybody to sign, except for the driver. He signed later. We got everybody to co-sign what we witnessed. And when we came to my place, we quickly wrote the geth. We called the wife, and we handed the geth over to her. It was all done. Then he calls me up, and we were talking to him, and he says, "You haven't given the geth yet, have you?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you told me you'll wait for me to authorize you to do it." So I said to him, "Listen, why don't you just give her the geth?" I didn't want to tell him that we already did it, because he was. I said, "Why don't you already give her a geth? It's not gonna. If you have any chance to agree to, you're not a kohen. You can always remarry her if she will want to marry you again. But if you refuse her the geth, she will not be so amicable to do so." So he argued with me, and the following day called me up and said, "You know what? Give over the geth." And I told him, "Yeah, I've given the geth." The question which I had was that any question at the time when the geth was given, he wasn't agreeable to it. Because later on he told me, even though what I suggested to him about just doing the authorization, it was like in the middle of 100 other things that I suggested to him, and he didn't react to it. But later he acted as if that's what he caught on to. So I wrote a tshuva, a response, and I sent it to Rabbi Ulman, the same one that we're davening for today, that he needs a refuah shleima. And I said to him that, it was a long argument. It wasn't just a short response. But what I was saying to him was that, when the husband makes the authorization, at the same time, he annuls any other statements that he has made against the geth, and he says he wants to give the geth of his own free will without compulsion or conditions. So the fact that he authorized it, and we gave the geth, and later he came along and he said that he had something else in mind, it doesn't change anything. And I actually found a supporting argument in the response of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who had even a more problematic situation, and he still allowed it. And Rabbi Zalman Nechemia, he wrote to me right away that he agrees with my argument, and the geth is kosher, and therefore she's divorced. Unfortunately, about 6 months later, the husband tragically passed away, and about a year or 2 years later, she got engaged to somebody else. And the rabbi who was marrying her, he said to him, what should I write in the get? Is she a widow or a divorcee? I said, she's definitely a divorcee. She's not a widow because the get was kosher, and therefore you write in the ksuba as a ksuba for divorcee, not for a widow. So this is some of the very, very sort of concise and short ideas about the Jewish get. And another time we'll talk also about a very difficult subject of the agunas, of women who are not, who for whatever reason the husband is not cooperating, doesn't want to give them a get. And sometimes we're also the other way around, when the husbands want to get a get and the wife is not cooperating, and how we deal with it. But in the meantime, we'll see if you have any questions. I think the questions from before also.
Yes, so we'll start with a couple questions that we were left with last week, and then we'll go on to the questions from today. I just want to remind everyone that the website rabbiulman.com is now up, and there is a tab called Ask the Rabbi, and you can submit your question over there. Please submit questions for future lectures. So the first question we have from last week's lecture is like this: does a non-Jew who is civilly married to a Jewish woman have to convert according to halacha?
Right. It's an interesting question, because on one hand, a non-Jew never has to convert, and the only way the conversion could be valid if a person wants to convert, on one hand. On the other hand, we have a very, very important concept in Judaism. And I touched upon it last time. You know, we're the only religion that on one hand we never necessitate for anybody to convert, to make it difficult. And we believe that every person can express themselves the way they are born. A Jew can only express himself being a Jew, and a person who wasn't born Jewish can only express himself, he could express himself as a righteous Gentile, as we call it, and only if he really insists he could convert. But there's also a concept in Judaism of soulmates, that God created each person for their designated soul. And the only way to be soulmates if you either are both Jewish or both non-Jewish. And therefore, as much as Judaism never puts any human being down, or never looks down on anybody, but nevertheless, we believe that intermarriage is a travesty for both Jews and non-Jews alike, because each one doesn't have the benefit of finding their soulmate. And it's a torment for both of the souls. And therefore, I cannot say that the non-Jew must convert. If he wants to convert and he becomes a righteous convert, then, and they get married, then they could be soulmates. But if he doesn't convert, then the only solution for them in order to find their own soulmate is to go each separate way, and each one should find his or her happiness by finding their soulmate that belongs to the neshama.
Okay, next question. Is the conversion certificate automatically sent to the convert, or is it sent only when requested by the convert?
With our Beth Din, we give it a year after conversion if they live up to their undertakings which they've made. And it's, again, if there's no law about it, you could give it in theory you could give it immediately, but last week I explained why 10 years ago we chose to give it a year testing period to see how the convert is living up to what they have taken upon themselves.
All right. It's said that a person feels their soul is Jewish, leading them to convert. Why does the person receive a new soul during the mikveh when he's converting?
It also, this question is quite good, because when a person becomes a righteous convert, in a way it shows that they always had this pilot light. They had a connection, but ultimately it was only potential. It wasn't actual. And when they convert, they actually receive the Jewish soul in the fullest context, in the fullest sense. And there's no doubt neither in this world or the spiritual world.
Okay, so now some questions from today's lecture. If a married man has relations with an unmarried woman and she has a child, is the child considered a mamzer, or is it only when the woman is married?
Correct. The child is not a mamzer. It's not. It's very important to understand that in Judaism, not always when we're talking about different levels of severity, does it mean that it's okay to do something. People asking me that, if, for example, to have a child out of wedlock, is a child a mamzer? We said emphatically no, it's not a mamzer. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's okay to, in other words, in Jewish law, to sanctify a union, you have to get married under chuppah. So one has to understand that not always the comparison between different severities indicates that one is not wrong, it's still wrong. So, for example, even though the ultimate definition of niyuv, of adultery, in the fullest sense of consequences with the consequences on children and so on and so forth, is only when a married woman has a extramarital relationship. Still, it's a very, very terrible sin for a husband to be unfaithful. And as a matter of fact, in the Talmud, when it talks about this unusual law called soita, when in times of the temple there was special test for a woman who was suspected of adultery, and the priest would prepare a special cocktail from the Megillah, from the ink in the from the biblical verses, with special ingredients, and she would drink it, and the waters would prove if she's innocent or not. The Talmud says that when husbands began to be unfaithful, the waters stopped testing the wives, so they stopped using it, because the rationale is that the husband, as much as the wife could be wrong for what she did, the husband cannot be a hypocrite and do something wrong himself, and therefore the Talmud says that the waters had these magic powers if the husband was unfaithful. So while we have a difference of halachic ramifications between men and women and definitions of adultery, it doesn't mean in any way that Judaism tolerates or justifies adultery for anybody.
All right. Does a geth document have the same handwriting as a ksuba?
No, the ksuba could be written in many different ways. The ksuba can be written in a regular typewriter and different fonts. The geth has to have the laws of the tsuras ha'esias, which means the shape of letters that are used for tefillin, mezuzah, or Torah. That's a must.
What happens to children of the divorced couple? Are the children mentioned in the bill of divorce?
No, the bill of divorce doesn't mention children. Sometimes, especially in Israel, where the Jewish divorce is also the civil divorce, different arrangements of custody and such are being decided before divorce is given, in order to make sure that by the time divorce is given, everything is already arranged. The children, hopefully, if the parents are sensitive to the children, they'll realize that even if a divorce happens, the kids are still the children of both the father and the mother, and therefore the father and the mother have to treat each other with respect in order that the kids should grow up healthy and not have a trauma seeing the parents in conflict.
All right. What is written on the divorce, i.e., what are the conditions and obligations that are enforced?
Right. The divorce itself, I should have read some of that for you, but it's very different to the ksuba. The ksuba is a separate document. The marriage document is not the marriage itself. So when it comes to marriage document, there's the marriage which takes place, and the marriage takes place through the giving of the ring from the bridegroom to the bride in front of witnesses. That's how the actual marriage becomes valid. And separate to the marriage, there is obligation to have a ksuba, which is basically obligations mainly of the bride to the bridegroom to the bride that he presents to her. He takes upon himself prior to the chuppah all the obligations, and it lists all the financial obligations, including some of them even after marriage. Some obligations while they're married, what he has to do as a husband, and some that take place in case of, God forbid, death or divorce. When it comes to geth, it's different, because the geth itself, it's not conditions, it's actual bill that separates between them. And therefore, over there's no conditions. On the contrary, the geth has to be unconditional. If a geth is made with conditions, it becomes problematic. And basically what the geth says, the geth is written as a narrative of the husband, as opposed to the ksuba, which is written as a narrative of the witnesses. So the ksuba talks about the bride and the bridegroom in third tense. The bridegroom so-and-so and the bride so-and-so, and what happens to them and how they got married and so on and so forth. The divorce is written as a narrative of the husband himself. It says, I, Abram called Abe, son of Yaakov called Jack, am on this and this date and this place, I'm giving a bill of divorce to the one who was my wife already from a long time before, And it goes on to basically to unequivocally to say that with this, once she accepts that bill of divorce, she becomes completely separate from him in every single way, and it's a total severance. There are quite a few verbs are used to show, and nouns are used to the extent of severance, and the fact that now she's permitted to marry anybody else, because until now she wasn't. So basically that's what the bill of divorce is all about.
All right, a question regarding the chalitza. What happens if the brother of the deceased husband is married or the woman has children? Does chalitza still take place?
It does take place. Who has children?
If the brother has children, the brother of the deceased or the actual woman that her husband died has children, will the chalitza still take place?
If the woman has children from the husband that died, the chalitza doesn't take place. The chalitza takes place only if the husband who died had no children with his wife. If she had prior kids, it's different, because the whole deal is perpetuating his name. But if the chalitza, if the brother-in-law is married and has kids, we still do chalitza 100%. And as a matter of fact, the two chalitzas that we did in Sydney, and I can talk about it later. I can also show you at a different lecture the actual shoe that is used for that purpose. But in both cases, the brother-in-law was married and children, and nevertheless he had to give a chalitza to his sister-in-law for her to be able to remarry.
Okay, we have two more questions. Could you please explain how a Jew used to have a second wife in the olden days without divorcing from the first wife? How was it halachically permitted?
Biblically, the Torah does allow, and there's reasons for it, which is some of them quite obvious for biological reasons, why it was never permitted to have more than one husband. That's something which, even if you look at the nature of the animal world, there's a lot embedded into it. And so we see that biblically it was never forbidden. You can see that it wasn't something which was practiced a lot. For example, you see that even Abraham or Jacob, Isaac didn't have more than one wife, but Abraham and Jacob, they only did it out of necessity. It wasn't because they wanted to take more than one wife. And we find that it happened mainly with kings, but with other Jewish leaders, we don't find that, even though it was permitted and it was used in a situation of necessity, such as if the wife would disappear, or if the wife became a vegetable or something like this. But for example, in the Talmud, I don't recall right now any of the great Talmudic teachers of all the periods of Talmud, which spans about 700 years or something. None of them that I can recall had more than one wife at a time, so it wasn't practiced. However, at a certain point in the 11th century, Rabbi Gershon, who was Ashkenazi leader, and I already spoke in one of my lectures how after the sealing of the Babylonian Talmud, there was no more central Beth Din that obligated all the Jews in any of the legislation. So all the legislations until the time obligated everybody. There was not such a thing as Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Yemenite Jews who would say, look, we never took upon ourselves the festival of Purim or Hanukkah or eating chicken with milk, which is a rabbinical addition to middle milk. So any legislation done from Moses until the end of the Babylonian Talmud was equally obligating to all the Jews in the world. After that time, it became more decentralized, and there's still legislations continue to be legislated, but there was no more a authority to obligate everybody, and therefore only the community that was under the authority of a particular rabbi, that community had to accept. So Rabbi Gershon made a legislation in the 11th century that one can no longer marry more than one wife. We'll talk about some of the possible exceptions and what happens in case of emergency, that he himself gave that mechanism to avoid critical problems, but it wasn't a biblical, he couldn't make it into a biblical obligation, it was a legislation. But that's the reality. Again, it wasn't the rabbis who have made the halacha, it's made by God himself, and he was the one that initially made it that it was possible, and later on he empowered the rabbis and obligated the Jews to follow that particular legislation, rabbis, that you couldn't do it any longer.
All right, final question for tonight. Someone's asking, who can be a witness for a geth?
Okay, a witness for geth, it could be a observant Jew, somebody who is completely religious. It's the same thing actually applies for witness at a chuppah. One of the obligations is that the person has to be observant in his life, keep Shabbos, keep kosher, and so on and so forth. But you also cannot be a relative to the other witness or to anybody else, or for example, to the bride or to the, sorry, not the bride, to the wife or to the husband. They're getting divorced, so the witness cannot be a relative. But the witness has to practice how to write, because the signature has to be written not as a regular signature. Like in the ksuba, you can write a regular signature. Any person who knows how to write Hebrew can write. But over here, if you can see, this geth was written by the scribe, but the bottom two lines were signed by witnesses. So these are signatures of witnesses. So you see, the witnesses had to know how to sign in the same handwriting. So this is a very important qualification. Usually you can teach them, but there has to be certain basic ability to be able to. They can't have two left hands, so to speak. If they're totally incapable of writing, it wouldn't go well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we're looking forward to see you, Emir Hashem, next week.